also want to talk about the tight ends in that range. And, when you try to think about the players that should go in the second round, and we talked about the tight ends a little bit before, but these guys, there's a lot of intriguing names. There's a lot of young guys coming up, and there's some aging ones that are good. Kelsey, Andrews, Kittle. David Njoku have the best season of his career on a per route run basis, earn a ton of volume. Evan Engram, potential beneficiary of some of the dynamic in Jacksonville that I talked about with Christian Kirk, where you have Gabe Davis as not a huge target earner, but a legitimate vertical threat that should open up some of the underneath passing. You have Brock Bowers coming in as a really intriguing rookie, like a great rookie potentially. I mean, and some of these factors have led to, you have Dallas Goedert all the way back at tight end 12 now, which in the past he has gone higher than that, obviously. TJ Hawkinson's at tight end 14. He would be in the top 5 if he didn't tear his ACL late in the year. He was obviously incredible. He's somebody that you can get cheaply and hope is back for the second half of the season and playing at a really high level. But eventually the tight end position does really thin out, and you get to like tight end 16, tight end 17, tight end 18. And you're like, I hope I have 2 tight ends by that point when you're drafting. And arguably, you hope you have 2 by like tight end 10, tight end 12. Shawn, I don't really understand the ADPs at the tight end position because there are, I understand why the market is acting this way because there's 8 to 10 intriguing names. So it's like, well, if I don't get LaPorta, then I can go after the next guy. If I don't get Kelsey, I can go after McBride. If I don't get McBride, I can go after Andrews. If I don't get Andrews, I can go after Kincaid. If I don't get Kincaid, I can go after Pitts. And so it's a game of chicken a little bit. But in the aggregate, it's not a deep position right now. There aren't that many great names. I would argue that probably there's 7, that are, you include Kyle Pitts in that group. And I do, I think I want to go down the Kyle Pitts road again. He's going tight end 6. George Kittle's going tight end 7. Then you have Engram at tight end 8. And that's where it starts to be, okay, we're in a different class from George Kittle to Evan Engram. Brock Bowers right behind that. David Njoku right behind that. Those are intriguing names. It's a little bit of a transition, right? There's never like a clear cutoff. But eventually, Jake Ferguson's going tight end 11. When I get there, I'm in a different group than I was when I was taking George Kittle a couple of rounds earlier. Why are these guys... Sam LaPorta going in the 3rd round, Travis Kelce going in the 4th, Trey McBride going in the 5th, and Andrews in the 5th, and Kincaid, I guess, at the very end of the 5th. Why is it that this seemingly sparse position doesn't have anyone going up in the 2nd round, where it feels a little bit bone dry in that range? Why isn't it that all of these top 7 guys aren't gone by the 4th or the 5th round? Because it is such a key to your builds to be getting one of these elite tight ends.
It is. And yet, I do think that drafters are playing Underdog differently. And I think that there is some justification to that. I think the fact that you got the big scores from Sam LaPorta and Trey McBride from a different portion of the draft last year gives people some confidence that you should chase that approach as opposed to chasing the individual player. Now, for me at tight end, it's very much a matter of the individual player as opposed to believing that we can look at the structural elements. Now, I say that the RotoViz roster construction explorers have been extremely successful in demonstrating a variety of things that you wanted to do through the years. And certainly, if you have played based on the information in the RCEs, then your win rates would have been fantastic in all formats kind of over the seasons. But I think that one of the things that we want to look at with the tight ends is that it's the impact of actually having the star tight end, regardless of where that comes from, that just completely changes your team. And every single season we see that. And so it's a matter of how do you accomplish that objective in the given year. Now, I think that the other thing that we're seeing beyond maybe this element of, okay, there have been some seasons where the late guys blew up and were the answer. There's also a case where, as you described it, because there are so many players in terms of arguably going to 10. If you're going to give people 10 tight ends, then people are going to feel like, well, everybody is going to get one, or 10 of the 12 teams are going to get one. As long as you're not the guy who sits there and doesn't take your tight end in those first 10, you're going to be fine. There's no need to be on the front end of that, which is going to continually push the players down. And I think because there's no clear-cut number one that you have to take super early, that it additionally pushes all the players down. Now, Sam LaPorta is coming off of an unbelievable rookie season. The talent portion of that is not in question at all. But when you look at how many mouths they have to feed, there is a concern about the overall numbers, and there's even a concern. You have last season where he was one of the key guys to push you from the first round of the playoffs into the semifinals. But then is he a guy who can break through and have 3 consecutive massive games like a Kelsey obviously could, an Andrews obviously could? I would argue that a Trey McBride could. If Kyle Pitts, if he finally breaks out, could. Dalton Kincaid could. I mean, Sam LaPorta, when he's competing with Amon-Ra St. Brown, who's a very clear-cut, straightforward first-round pick, when there's that slight potential that Jameson Williams breaks out. I mean, there were some minor signs, and certainly the Lions have talked up a breakout there. And then when you're competing with just how many touches those 2 running backs are going to get, and so you can have a game where the Lions take the lead and then they don't have to pass. And you add in the minor additional element of, like, is Jared Goff going to have a ton of games where he leads the Lions to 40 plus points, or creates such a massive pie? Now, one of the things is the Lions had a massive pie last season, and I think that we can project that forward. But when Jared Goff is the guy pulling the trigger, I think that there is a little bit of a ceiling. If you just had a sexier name at QB, I think Amon-Ra St. Brown would be going 3 or 4 spots higher, which, 3 or 4 spots, but you're talking about the first round, right? I think that Sam LaPorta would be going a little bit earlier. But the fact that the number one guy is maybe also less likely to go on like a pure run where he dominates for 3-4 consecutive weeks compared to the next bunch of players, I think that pushes them all down. But for me, that means that you need to have 2, because if you have 2, you can put them together. The tight ends, when they do go off, are viable in the flex. You have this, obviously when you're drafting and you're thinking I'm going to win the whole thing, you're thinking the guys are going to stay healthy. But in terms of getting teams there, and maybe the rest of your team is amazing. Like, you've hit perfectly on the perfect team, and your only problem is that your star tight end got hurt. Well, if you've got 2, then you still have one. Right now, again, it's going to hurt you a bunch to lose that caliber of player. But if you nailed the entire rest of your draft and you have the 2, then you still have 1, right? So there are a lot of different ways in which having the 2 guys is the way to play it. And as a result, I would argue that the ADPs are broken from the perspective of, make sure that you get one, but it's also broken from a structural perspective of that if enough drafters were approaching it properly, they would just be going a little bit earlier because there'd be more of a battle for those guys.
And there should be. I love the way that you broke down the individual names. LaPorta feels very, very safe, but I feel the same way, that there's just not as clear of a ceiling case. That's why I keep saying in different places that I think Trey McBride should be the tight end 1. I think McBride is a riskier play, but I have talked through. He had the better targets per route run. He was like the more clear, dominant force in his passing game last year. I think he's got the clear path to be the clear guy in his passing game. They are going to probably add Marvin Harrison, but rookies aren't typically immediately the featured name. One of the things about Harrison's price that I've been a little concerned about is, even if he is a massive hit right away, if you go look back at Jamar Chase and Justin Jefferson and the hits that they were as rookies, in year 2, they both went up considerably in targets per game. I think it's about 2 targets per game. So neither of them, even as massive hits, were the value that they ultimately became right away as a rookie, because it's hard to step onto an NFL field at the very beginning, even if you're very, very good and you're very efficient and all that stuff, and command massive volume. And so what Marvin Harrison brings is a lot of attention from defenses, but probably not the immediate demand of like 10 targets per game. Like, that's probably more a year 2 thing for him, which means that Trey McBride in 2024, after a season where he had a monster targets per out run and broke out and looked like for all intents and purposes, like the guy in this passing game and played really well with Kyler down the stretch after Kyler came back. He's in position to do that again, right? And so
and I guess
the
that
ceiling
some
is
listeners didn't watch a lot of Cardinals games because they wouldn't have been very exciting. But if you did get a chance to watch the Cardinals, I mean, Trey McBride was bursting through your screen as an unstoppable force.
right. It wasn't just target earning. Like it wasn't, here's a bunch of targets. Like here's Zach Ertz or whatever. It was like George Kittle-esque. Once he got the targets, it was like, now I'm like very physical, very hard to bring down. I'm mean. I'm the tight end that, like that's the tight end you want on your fantasy team. It's fun to watch. You're like, this guy's good. It was like baby Gronk, I mean, it was a guy that was earning volume. And then after the catch was gonna, put punishment on players. And then after he got tackled, get up and yell a lot, I mean, you're like, yeah, this guy's sweet. Like, I mean, Trey McBride was awesome down the stretch. And then the numbers back that up if you actually dig into them. So getting him at the 4-5 turn is ludicrous. He's going just ahead of Mark Andrews. You mentioned I had some notes on Andrews. He's interesting. They changed coordinators finally, right? Last season, Greg Roman was gone. They brought in Todd Monken, and there was a pretty substantial change to Mark Andrews' profile. He was still good, but not necessarily in the same ways that he had been. And this is, he got hurt. So we're going to look at this on like a per route basis. His ADOT has always been in the double digits, which the average tight end is about like 7.5. And the average receiver is more like 11, which obviously there's different receiver roles as well. But Andrews, early in his career, right around 11, first 4 years. In 2022, it finally fell down to 10.1. It's kind of just over 10, but still in that range of where it looks more like the average receiver. He's a vertical tight end. Last year was down at 8.2. So you get a pretty substantial drop in that regard. You also get a pretty substantial drop in targets per route. He's always been very high there, but he also was running a lot of routes. So they did a little bit more of a spread offense. There's a change in his alignment. He had previously never been in the slot on more than 2/3 of his snaps, usually in the low 60s, his slot rate. He's in the slot a decent amount, but he's still, he's in the low 60s. He's still in line about 20% of the snaps or out wide sometimes as well. Last year in this offense, he was in the slot over 80% of his snaps. So it was a pretty substantial bump from his previous career high slot rate. That's basically all he did. He was their slot receiver. He was not out wide very frequently. He was in line just about 10% of the time, a career low. And I think that plays into the lower ADOT, where they just had him running a lot of these slot routes. A little bit of a different profile, where he's not getting off, into down the seam on play action as much and things like that, where the old Ravens under Greg Roman, they ran the ball a ton, but they use those run formations to set up play action, to do some different things, have multiple tight ends in the formations, and then you're leaking Mark Andrews down the field to get these explosive big plays. Andrews still had a really good yards per target last year, but I would say that, and that's why his yards per out run still looks similar, which you mentioned when we brought that up, but I would be concerned about that, where it was more efficiency based on a lower ADOT. If you adjust for depth, his efficiency was really astronomical last year relative to where it's been in his career. And his targets per out run were down at a lower ADOT. Typically, again, higher ADOT, you're going to have a lower targets per out run. It's harder to earn volume down the field. We've mentioned the weighted targets per out run stat a couple times. Andrew's weighted targets per out run in 2023 is where you see the big difference. It had never been below 0.6. Never been below 0.62 since his rookie year. It was at 0.51 last year. So that was the previous career low, and it's quite a bit below that. His best year in terms of per route volume was 0.85 weighted targets per out run. He's been in the 0.6s otherwise. All of that adds up to him being at about 6.1 targets per game, I think it was. Now he left one game early. But that was closer to his like 2019, 2020 rates, whereas 2021 is when he had the major breakout. He was at 9.0 targets per game that year. He was at 7.5 in 2022, not being even at 7 targets per game last year and being down at 6 targets per game, essentially. A little bit of a concern for me there that the usage, the profile, the offense, a little bit different He's still a very good tight end. He still has spike week potential. There's all of those things that are still there. But what's always made Mark Andrews a really intriguing potential top 3 tight end maybe doesn't exist anymore. Maybe it does, but it's a different role. It's a different offense. It's clear there in his alignment, in his usage, in his ADOT, in the per route volume, but also his routes were higher. They ran more routes. They threw more. He had at one point 7 straight games over an 82% route rate, which is not the kind of usage that he saw as a tight end in an offense that showed a lot of run block looks and then did play action and stuff. He wouldn't always be at 80% routes, in the old Greg Roman offense either. So offsetting some of the per route volume dip with more routes is certainly one path to getting there as well. But again, that's why I went back to just straight up targets per game and said, look, it was down a little bit. Now, some of that also comes from the increased competition. You talked about, Zay Flowers being an intriguing wide receiver target. And I think you have to bump what he did as a rookie when you look at the fact that he probably stole some volume from Mark Andrews, which is, a favorable way to look at what Flowers did. But yeah, I mean, Monken is more, we knew he was a spread guy and all of that stuff. And he's more of a wide receiver heavy coordinator, right? He maybe doesn't view tight ends as the type of weapon that other coaches do. Andrews is still a very good tight end. I'm not saying Monken's not going to use him, and I'm not saying he didn't use him. 6 targets per game is still a lot. I am saying that I am a little bit concerned about Andrews' overall ceiling in this offense. But at the same time, I think all these tight ends are too cheap. So, I'm not saying I wouldn't draft Andrews at this price either. It's just that I like he's going 5 picks behind McBride and 5 picks ahead of Dalton Kincaid. And I think I strongly prefer both of the other ADPs, the 2 younger players at those prices.
Well, then let's finish this out by looking at the guys at the tail end of this group. You mentioned Dalton Kincaid. He's somebody where, especially after the Stephon Diggs trade, and we would assume that now the Bills are going to make some additional move to add a weapon. But, Dalton Kincaid looks like the driver of that offense. His ADP, I think, is broken. Kyle Pitts is interesting. We've talked about him at length. We don't need to do more of that today. But in the middle of the 6th, we know he's gotten more expensive with Kirk Cousins. People have been excited about him. Certainly in FFPC drafts with the tight end premium, I see him go very early sometimes because there is the potential for, with the tight end premium, that if he has a big season, it could be an absolutely gigantic season. You get down to this next group with George Kittle, Evan Engram, Brock Bowers, David Njoku. I think that's an interesting quartet. And then Jake Ferguson is in there with Njoku. I guess I would be more skeptical about him simply because that production seems to be the offense and Dak Prescott. So, maybe a much, narrower mode, or perhaps not. Maybe the structural things are the things that are actually key there. And maybe he's done enough to separate himself. But
probably not a huge ceiling because he's more routes based than per route production. So even if you mentioned the narrow mode, I agree with it. But even if he keeps that and doesn't get displaced by some other tight end or something, what's the ceiling? He's going to be good, but I think there's potential for greatness in some of these other names.
Yeah, and one of the things when you think back to last season is that, for me at least, it feels like George Kittle had an off year. And then, if you kind of want to split the difference between tight end premium and half PPR, you pull him up and you're like, he had a 27.7 game. So this is just one PPR. He had a 27.7 game, a 23.9 game, a 20.6 game, a 22.9 game, a 16.6 game, and a 19.6 game. You're like, oh, that's not a bad season. Now, he had some down games, but certainly, especially in best ball, you're like, oh, George Kittle was tearing the roof off again. You look at some of these other guys, and so I guess just quickly before I go into Njoku versus Engram, is Kittle a super easy play?
Yeah.
Or okay.
I would have him. I was mentioning a little bit earlier, but like sort of the 7th of the top 7 that I really want to. I want a lot of exposure to, because for the reasons you just said, like, yeah, I don't think he should go necessarily any higher because of the competition in that offense, but for the reasons you just said, like, he clearly has spike week potential. He's still very good. That offense is still going to score a ton of points. He's going to have games like that, and that's good in best ball. Like, I want, and we know he's talented. It's not like that's going anywhere. So yeah, I mean, he's a pretty straightforward pick, and that ADP is 70. Like, that's easy.
So then we get down to Engram, Bowers, and Njoku. And this trio, I think, is pretty interesting. With Bowers, obviously, you have all of the rookie elements, and we've kind of talked about that with our rookie shows. Engram and Njoku, I think, can be a sort of a fun conversation, can be a controversial conversation. Njoku absolutely blows up down the stretch. And, again, if you want to look at the full PPR for a second, the last 4 weeks of the season, you get a 27-point game, a 26-point game, a 16-point game, and a 19-point game. And, if we look at it from this perspective of, how is the offense changing? What's the difference between maybe having Deshaun Watson and having like anybody else? One of the things that happened, from week 7 on, is that he averaged over 15 points per game in a full PPR format. That's pretty remarkable. Now, his profile is interesting because the target depth was really low, but he crushed the field in yards after contact. And so, maybe you have some concern about, how that's going to transition. I think in a perfect world, obviously you'd have deeper targets, but the other element there is that David Njoku has been this freakishly athletic tight end that we've been waiting to break out for a long, long time. If you have the underneath targets, then your catch rate, unless, the person pulling the trigger is an absolute disaster, your catch rate's going to be high. You get the ball in your hands, you can run with it. So the catches are going to help you from a scoring perspective. And then you have this very good floor in terms of the weekly workload. And then obviously he's demonstrated the ceiling. And one of the things he delivered there as well were kind of that, mile touchdown breakout as you go along, almost a half touchdown per game last season. You contrast that with Engram, who is in this interesting situation as well, where the routes, well, number one, you've got a very shallow target depth for him also. And he's kind of the beneficiary of this broken offense with the Jaguars, where you have injuries to Zay Jones, you have injuries to Christian Kirk, where he doesn't play the full season. You also have some weird decisions that the Jaguars made during the year where they acquire Calvin Ridley. He has the highest route percentage on the team, but it's dedicated to sort of a prayer yards kind of profile there. Christian Kirk's route percentage really falls from the previous season. One of the things that you've noted, one of the things that seems very straightforward to me is that I guess I'm skeptical that the Jaguars fix all their problems, but it does seem like Christian Kirk is not going to be the guy that they are going to take off the field on a bunch of plays like they did last season. Then you contrast David Njoku's season with Evan Ingram's, where Engram gets a jump from his 2022 route percentage to his 2023 route percentage, in part because of the injuries to Christian Kirk and Zay Jones. And I think we would expect the Jaguars to potentially be in a situation where he doesn't get quite that same level of opportunity, even with Calvin Ridley leaving. And so for me, I have Njoku higher. And I don't mind taking either of these guys if they're the last person who comes to me. But certainly, even though I think these are very viable high-scoring veteran players. They're not the same level of target for me. I really would prefer to get the guys before that. And with Njoku, I mean, I don't think that Jerry Jeudy. I've told myself I wasn't going to draft Jeudy again, but I'm back on board. Certainly, if Jeudy does anything, that is going to change the available targets for Njoku as well. How should we be looking at these two guys, and are they targets?
They're both very intriguing to me because they both had career high targets per out run rates in 2023. We know that tight ends take longer to break out, all those types of things. You talked a little bit about Njoku's specific usage. The production on the stretch, it's a little concerning that it was with Joe Flacco. You talked about, kind of alluded to different quarterbacks being good at that. Flacco's always been really good at the dump offs, right? Like the running backs always had the really high target rates. The way this Browns offense worked last year, it was like the outlet player was Njoku. It was like a block and release, and he would catch the ball at the line of scrimmage when Flacco couldn't see something down the field. He'd just drop it off to Njoku, which led to a really high targets per out run rate, and also got him in space and running downhill on some plays where he was. You talked about his really high yards after contact. Part of it's like, okay, was this just the Joe Flacco effect? Was it just the dump off? He's good at these dump offs and all of that stuff. But also part of it's like what you kind of alluded to as well. It's like, well, maybe they just like this Browns team finally figured out how to use David Njoku. Like just use his blocking ability and then have him kind of release into an outlet spot. And then if you dump it off to him, you'd rather have him running downfield than a running back out of the backfield in some cases. Maybe not Nick Chubb, but a lot of the running backs that you might be dumping it off to. Instead, let's have David Njoku catch the ball around the line of scrimmage and start running downhill at some linebackers. And it worked really well. They also did a lot down the field. But I think that was a big part of his profile last year where I struggle. I mean, when I say that his targets per out run were a career high, they were a career high by like almost 3 percentage points. He was up close to he was at 23%. So up, and previously his career high is about 20%. He's up in this range that's like really strong suddenly. He was also at a career high in routes. The same, by the way, is true as Evan Engram, who was at a career high targets per out run and a career high routes. Both of them did that last year where they put their most route volume and their best routes or targets per route numbers together in the same season. But for Njoku, that jump was bigger, and it was bigger because of that subset of plays that I was kind of talking about. As you noted, his ADOT way lower, 2+ yards lower than any other season in his career, and more like 3 to 4 yards lower than most seasons. Because often he was another guy who had one of those above average ADOTs at tight end. And last year he was at 4.8. I mean, this is a very, very low ADOT, which is largely due to this subset of passes that were just dump offs, essentially, or at least that's the way that I would, having watched the games, would analyze the distribution of his targets and those things. Again, still made plays down the field and everything. But for me, I'm intrigued. So I would say there's the two parts of it. One, there's a little bit of concern that if all that goes away, these little dump offs and everything, the target rate just comes back down and he's just normal again. But he was, or like sort of his normal profile is what I meant there. But he was efficient on these looks. He was efficient with the ball in his hands. And it was a type of sort of breakout or a usage breakout that we would expect, I think, the Browns to want to lean into that again. A little bit, at least, even if it's Deshaun Watson or whoever's at quarterback. So anyway, I think Njoku's really interesting, and I would also probably have him ahead of Engram, but I really like the Engram play as well from the perspective of, the adding Gabe Davis and all the positive things I said about Christian Kirk, and I just think this passing game is going to have a lot of those underneath passes available. And I do agree with you, Ingram's bumps in routes and in targets per route seem a lot more directly aligned with players on his team being injured last year that presumably won't be injured this year. And he wasn't nearly as efficient as Njoku. So you don't have especially when you control for like depth and those things, you don't have the element where, for Njoku, it was a career high yards per out run, not just targets per out run, yards per out run. For Engram, it wasn't. He had the highest targets per out run, better than his best Giants years early in his career, but not even really close to his best Giants year in terms of yards per out run, where the efficiency was a lot better and some of that stuff. So he's intriguing to me. But again, to your point, I think I guess the way I'm looking at it, and maybe I want to hear your thoughts on this, because I guess the way I'm looking at it is Brock Bowers, who is maybe the best tight end prospect, I don't know, ever. Like you would know better than me, but people are talking about him the way that we talked about Kyle Pitts a few years ago. The rookies just don't always hit, at tight end. And so I guess the way I'm looking at it is I'm like, I'd probably prefer both these guys to the rookie, where I have to assume landing spot and immediate target volume and production and all of those things. It was incredible to get that out of Sam LaPorta last year. There was other intriguing rookie tight ends that didn't do it last year. Kincaid was one of the other sort of hits where we're excited about him in year 2, but didn't necessarily smash from a point scoring perspective for most of the year. Those guys aren't, even the same level of profile as Bowers, even LaPorta, who was a good, very, very good prospect. I guess my concern is just like at ADP 80, are we, LaPorta we were getting at 140 or something like that. Are we assuming too much, and how much, surplus value can he really give as a rookie at that price? And so I guess I lean towards the boring veteran Shawn. I'm getting old and I'm getting boring. We used to just always talk up the rookies, but these last couple of years we've been talking about, Mike Evans and Keenan Allen last year, and now this year I'm like, I would rather have Evan Engram and David Njoku than Brock Bowers. But I think that's where I wind up landing, is I guess I probably just prefer taking the veterans. So what am I missing with Brock Bowers? Convince me to draft more Brock Bowers. I want to.
Well, it's going to change for you. You're not going to be there the whole offseason.
Got it.
I mean, there's no comparison between Bowers and Dalton Kincaid and Sam LaPorta. I mean, Brock Bowers put up 880 yards and 13 touchdowns as a freshman at Georgia. And I mean, when you're talking about somebody who is going to be drafted into a spot where they're expected to produce right away, and whose career trajectory suggests that they will make the leap like an elite wide receiver. I mean, for me, if you're going to make me pick Marvin Harrison or Malik Neighbors, like Marvin Harrison in the middle or like the early second round, Malik Neighbors in the early third round, or you can get a tight end prospect who is better than both of them in round 7. I mean, you're getting like a 5-round discount. Now, again, we have a different way that these guys transition. But, I mean, Brock Bowers is, and also, I mean, the audience never really wants to hear the word Kyle Pitts again, right? But there's also no comparison between Brock Bowers and Kyle Pitts. I mean, just no comparison. So I think that you have
just because he was so much better early at Georgia. Pitts was also a 3-year early declare, but wasn't really productive until his 3rd year. Is that, and even still not as productive as Bowers was as a freshman? Is that sort of the way why you would classify it that way?
Right. And when you're looking at Bowers' last 3 seasons as they rank against like all the other tight end college seasons, he's basically like just like his 3 seasons are the best seasons. The best season for Kincaid and LaPorta will filter in there for some specific types of things. But Brock Bowers, it isn't just good at like one thing. You look at the catch percentage, you look at the after catch ability, you look at the after contact ability, you look at the touchdown ability, you look at the yards per route. I mean, just every single thing for Brock Bowers, he is destroying the world.
5 rushing touchdowns and a career 10.2 yards per carry on 19 carries. He has 193 rushing yards on 19 carries and 5 touchdowns. He's the best running tight end prospect of all time.
I mean, his stuff is just it. And again, I mean, you can get overly excited about rookies, right? You have the rookie derangement syndrome. It's hard to argue rookie derangement syndrome is not a real thing when you see Marvin Harrison at the like 16th overall pick. But again, it's like the risk of Marvin Harrison at 16 overall versus Brock Bowers in round 7. I mean, I just don't think there's any comparison. I feel much more comfortable taking Bowers at that point.
Okay, well, so you said I wasn't going to be that way all offseason. I'm already excited to draft Bowers over Engram and Njoku. Like, that was quick. That was very, very quick. Yeah, I mean, am I on the clock in any leagues? Can I go draft Bowers right now? So, Sean, after that little range, and so those are interesting names outside of the top clear tight ends. But after that range, it does get a little tricky. You get Jake Ferguson, who doesn't really have big target earning potential. He did step into and essentially give us a Dalton Schultz season. He stepped into the Dalton Schultz role, and he gave us a Dalton Schultz season, which means, his targets per out run was just below 20%, which is okay. But the big thing for him is he ran 522 routes last year, Jake Ferguson. And the efficiency was solid. I mean, he was good at yards per target. And so you wind up with a decent yards per out run. His 1.46 yards per out run by PFS numbers basically matched Dalton Schultz's best season of 1.47 in 2021. And then Schultz was at 1.38 in 2022. It's that, you look at Schultz's 2021 and 2022 and Jake Ferguson's 2023, and they're the same player. The stats all fit so perfectly together, which isn't really to criticize either of them other than to say it does feel like a role in the offense more than these guys are the types that draw volume away from other players. And Schultz was interestingly a very similar player to that in Houston when he went there. His 1.47 yards per out run matched his best season from Dallas. His targets per out run was sub 20%. Again, in a passing game that didn't have a lot of competition, he comes in a couple spots behind Ferguson. I'm comfortable taking these guys if I need a tight end. I think they're going to run a lot of routes. I think they're going to earn enough volume on those routes to give me some floor games, some solid production out of the tight end position. Whereas there's the possibility with a lot of later round tight ends that you're just not getting anything out of them, obviously. We know that at this position. They're in the next 3, along with Dallas Goedert. I would probably bump Goedert higher, just banking on, this is a profile that's a little bit more intriguing from a per route perspective, even though it hasn't hit in big ways over the last couple of years. The routes have never been massive, et cetera. And last year was really, a career low for him in yards per route run and some of those things. So you're hoping kind of bounces back. But it gets less intriguing when you start to get to this range. You get to the injured TJ Hawkinson. You get to Cole Kmet, who I was really into before they added Keenan Allen. I'm still willing to take those swings on Kmet. But this is really where, it goes quick from the back end of the intriguing tight end, top 7 or 8 or whatever. We were talking about Kincaid and Kyle Pitts and Kittle, that transition group of Engram, Bowers, and Njoku. And now we're like, I would be okay with Ferguson and Schultz and some of those guys. And as you get, into round 10, 11, 12, 13, the tight end position thins out. You have Cade Otton coming a couple more spots later. Cade Otton really didn't earn volume last year. There's a guy who ran a lot of routes, but was so low in targets per out run that, you can't draft him. He's a sub 1 yards per route run guy. I don't know. The routes were really strong, but I don't know how you can really justify drafting a guy who had an 11.8% targets per route run and wasn't much higher as a rookie the year prior. He's run over 1,000 routes in his first 2 years and earned basically no volume on them. He's just not a guy that's going to earn a lot of volume, is the way that I would describe it.
You're just drafting him late if you're not covered and you're looking at the touchdown.
Yeah, you're looking. He's going to be on the field, and he could potentially spike on some TDs and things like that. But again, that's only 4 more spots behind Kmet. I was kind of reading down the list when I got to Kmet. Then you have Freiermuth, Luke Musgrave, Michael Mayer. Mayer's and Musgrave, those are your 2 guys that didn't have the rookie years, don't have the situations of a LaPorta or a Kincaid, but you don't have to pay the same prices, and maybe you can justify making those year 2 bets a lot later. I'm pretty into Mayer still. But again, it starts to thin. And when you get to Otton, when you get to Hunter Henry, Jonnu Smith, Isaiah Likely, who's the tight end 2 in an offense that we just got done when we were talking about Mark Andrews saying isn't really valuing the tight end as much anymore under Todd Monken. Juwan Johnson, Tyler Conklin. That's a list of tight ends I don't want to be really getting into at this stage of the offseason. Some of these guys might get supplanted still. There could be some movement. Obviously, there will be some tight ends drafted. What do you think about that next? I mean, especially like relative to ADP, Jake Ferguson going at 93. Dalton Schultz is at 118, closer to the end of round 10. Goddard's in between there. Hawkinson's 125. Kmet's 135. Freiermuth 143. That range, is there anyone that sticks out to you as the break glass in case of emergency sort of fallback option? Or do you really want to try to get 2 tight ends prior to that and just do 2 tight end builds where you can?
I think the names will work if you only get one. And frankly, you're certainly going to have plenty of drafts where you only come out with one. And so you do have to have some contingencies in place. The name that jumps out is Cole Kmet. And when you look at Kmet compared to Engram and Njoku, when we just discussed, the target per route numbers almost identical. The weighted target per route numbers almost identical. The big difference there is the route percentage is much lower, and so the total routes are much lower. You look at Kmet and kind of how people have shifted in their view of him, and so much of that is going to be related to the touchdowns, right? His 2023 season is not that different than the 2021 season, other than you have a big spike in the racer, in part potentially because the ADOT falls. And then you have this difference between the first couple of seasons where there are 2 total touchdowns, including a season with 0 touchdowns despite 91 targets. And then over the last 2 seasons, you have the 13 touchdowns. And again, when we're thinking about things that Justin Fields can do and what he brings to the table from a positive perspective, even if he has these weaknesses that led to his current situation, there were things that he did for both Kmet and for DJ Moore that were valuable. And you look at those 13 touchdowns over the last 2 years and think, well, if the new offense allows him to get into the route more often, then there's the potential for him to be the other guy, like the next player to take that sort of TJ Hawkinson light step. And so the question then comes back again. And I think it's interesting because it sort of ties back to earlier in the discussion of what is the offense going to be like? What is Caleb Williams going to be? How are you breaking down this DJ Moore, Keenan Allen battle? But also, if the offense works, yeah, those guys are going to soak up a lot of the volume, but there's not going to be a lot of defensive attention that can be pushed off or focused on Cole Kmet when you have those 2 elite wide receivers. So you're potentially looking at an extremely efficient season from Kmet. So I guess I would kick it back to you there. Do you see a path for him to add a significant number of routes? And should we be playing this from the perspective of, if you have a guy with a relatively wide range of outcomes who's being drafted in that area, and a wide range where the upside is meaningful as opposed to like it could be decent or awful. I mean, for Kmet, it could be decent or it could actually be pretty amazing. What happens here? I mean, he could be the breakout tight end for 2024. But even with that being the case, it probably is going to need to have a huge efficiency component.
Yeah, so I would agree with all of that. I mean, in terms of your question of whether there's the ability to add routes, I think yes. Whether there's the way that you broke down his profile, 2023 to me was a breakout for him. I mean, he had he came into the NFL as a young tight end, age 21 in 2020. So it was his 4th season. We like to see a breakout before year 4, probably. And arguably he had a breakout before year 4. But if you look at stuff like yards per route run, you were talking through this a little bit. His targets per route run stronger last year, and his yards per route run were stronger. He was more efficient last year. They were significantly stronger. That was one of the big steps forward, in addition to some of the touchdown stuff that you were talking about. We really do see him jump into a level of production per route that's impressive. And then the flip side of that, or the contextual note that I would add there, is that Justin Fields wasn't great for the per route numbers. Like, when you have a player who takes a lot of sacks and scrambles a lot, there's a lot of routes that don't become pass attempts. You can blame some of that on the receivers, but that, from a profile standpoint, mobile quarterbacks are going to make it harder to have gaudy per route numbers than immobile ones. Like, we were just talking about this a little bit with David Njoku. When you have Joe Flacco back there, he's going to dump it off to you so much. Your targets per route run can be a career high. It's going to be that way. It's a lot more possible to be that way. I don't know why the Dolphins are popping into my head, but Tyreek Hill can have these massive targets per out run numbers that lead the league by a lot. And Jalen Waddle can be not that far behind him because Tua doesn't scramble and he doesn't take a lot of hits either. He gets rid of the ball and the ball comes out to one of those guys. And so that's just a small contextual piece to Kmet's profile that made me even more excited than where his specific yards per route run and all of that would fit in. And that's why, prior to the Keenan Allen trade, I was like, man, he was good. Like, he was not that far behind DJ Moore in targets per route run in this offense. And they were way above everyone else. Darnell Mooney was way down the list. The rest of the guys in Chicago, not even really close to these dudes. And their numbers don't pop unless you compare them to the other players in the Chicago offense and acknowledge that, yeah, Justin Fields had a lot of dropbacks that didn't even become passes. And so if we do that and we say, okay, some of these are empty routes, then, first of all, we can be a little bit more optimistic about DJ Moore, and that's fair. But even doing that, DJ Moore's numbers aren't, getting back to our earlier Chicago discussion, they aren't massive. They're not astronomical. They're not uber elite or anything. They would be strong if you made an adjustment. For Kmet, if you make a little bit of an adjustment, you do start to talk about, and his numbers weren't as good as Moore, but you do start to talk about, especially, I guess, relative to perception. DJ Moore's a second-round receiver. Cole Kmet's going at ADP 134. If you do make a little bit of an adjustment, you can tell yourself, this is a 24-year-old tight end that just had a really strong season. And he did so, as you noted, running not a lot of routes. And he hasn't ever run a lot of routes. By PFF's numbers, which are more liberal than SIS's, he's never had a 500 route season. That's a small amount. Evan Engram last year, we just got done talking about, he had over 600 routes last year. One of the top tight ends in the league in routes run. But to not even have a 500 route season yet, banked for a guy who plays a lot, is notable. And so when you point him out, I think I've probably been too negative about how the Keenan Allen thing impacts him because it's still cost related. And at 134 of an ADP, you got me excited. I'm in full agreement. I think he's the key target in this range. I wanted to be even more in on him and be like, yeah, this is the obvious guy to go after because he's going to be DJ Moore's number 2 with a rookie quarterback that's probably not going to have a massive pass rate. It might take some sacks or what have you, but and he's mobile as well, but Caleb Williams is more mobile in the sense of, he can extend plays and some of those things. He's not. Justin Fields' rate of dropbacks that don't become a pass attempt is probably the highest in NFL history because he does take a lot of sacks and he does scramble at a really high rate. Caleb Williams is going to be more like your run-of-the-mill, can extend the play, will scramble some, will take some sacks, average mobility type.
And really the evolution of his play through college went from a guy who did scramble quite a bit and had a lot of rushing value to somebody who is moving to keep the play alive and throw. And that's one of the things that is, maybe a pretty bad sign for like his ceiling in fantasy, but it could be fantastic for his passing weapons.
Yeah.
So if you want to buy all of these 3 guys at ADP, I would. And one of the things too, Caleb Williams, the evasion numbers are really strong. And so you're looking at somebody where I expect him to be able to deal with NFL defenses and NFL pass rushers. Not that it's going to be seamless as a rookie, but that portion of it for him, again, I would be surprised if he busts because of that. And so anytime that you have just so many different ways in which you can get rid of the ball. If you can get rid of the ball based on the initial reads and the initial play call, or you can get rid of the ball, 5-6 seconds later, after you scramble all over the place, it just gives you so many different ways to get the balls to your guy. And It's one of the reasons why the comparisons to Patrick Mahomes, even though you wouldn't expect him to hit that upside, have some legitimacy, because it's the same type of way to approach how each play is going to work.
It's similar in that way. So well said. That's what I was trying to get to. You said that perfectly. That's been my perception of him as well in my read, and even of the Patrick Mahomes comps, that he relates in that way. And so anyway, very, very well said. That's what I was kind of trying to articulate, that it's going to be a lot better for when we break down things like the per route run numbers. It's going to be a lot better for Cole Kmet and DJ Moore than Justin Fields was last year in terms of the impact of this quarterback change. Now, that's just a micro part of their profile, what their per route run numbers are, but then it relates back to that point you made about, can Cole Kmet add routes? And the answer is yes, he definitely can. And I think he probably almost certainly sets a career high in routes run, but he also probably sets a career high in targets per route if last year's breakout was real. And so then you're talking about, a career high in routes and a career high in targets per route is what I just got done saying was really good for Evan Engram and David Njoku last year. If Cole Kmet goes out and does that this year, his best 2 seasons are 93 targets and 90 targets. You're talking about, over 100 targets. Now, maybe the part where he sets a career high in targets per route is tougher because of the Keenan Allen aspect, right? And so that's the part where I've been coming, back and forth with it. But it would be hard for me to see him after what he did last year, unless he takes a big step back on these peripherals. It'd be hard for me to see him get fewer targets than he got last year, right? Because the routes volume and everything we just said about the quarterbacks. And so there's a lot of intriguing elements here. If Keenan Allen has a hamstring injury at some point or something like that as well, DJ Moore misses some time. The way that I look at this is that the Bears have 3 players in their passing game. And then, basically no one else matters. It's going to be highly concentrated on those 3. I do think Kmet is very clearly the third, that Keenan Allen and DJ Moore are very clearly the top 2. But Kmet is the third. And I don't even know who the fourth is sort of the way that I'm trying. I guess Gerald Everett would maybe be the fourth, another tight end who his presence is a little bit concerning for Kmet. But I think you got to look at Kmet and say, this is a player who, from a profile perspective, when he initially came out as a prospect, was somebody that we were intrigued with. And he's been in some weird offenses, right, through his 4 seasons. He was initially playing under Matt Nagy. We've had the unique elements of Justin Fields' profile. He's shown flashes despite that. He's shown the TD scoring that you mentioned. He's shown some flashes, some spike weeks. I think the next iteration of his career is where we start to get some more consistency in the target volume and those things.
I'm looking forward to the draft, man. I'm looking forward to seeing how all of these young players do affect how we see the overall offenses, the depth charts, all of that. Chicago Bears, an interesting team. One of the things I would love to take all 3 of those receivers and the quarterback and put them in a dome. Got to wrap back around to other notes from earlier in the show. Well, that's going to do it for this episode of Stealing Bananas, where we looked at some broken ADPs. Certainly, there are broken ADPs at the QB position as well. That's something that we may jump into a little bit more in the future. But Ben, I enjoyed this so much. Again, if you're listening to this particular intro, you probably listened to the full long version of the show. We are going to be doing the Stealing Bananas shorts as well, where if you don't want to listen to us for a couple hours at a time, you can get those shorter pieces, which will be targeted with one of the themes or one of the concepts within the show. But again, appreciate everyone getting to this point with us. We'll have more content for you soon. I'm Shawn Siegele. With me, as always, is Ben Gretch. Make sure you follow him at Yards Per Gretch, at Stealing Lines, at Stealing Signals. We'd love to have you guys over at RotoViz. The coupon code there is RVRadio 2024 at checkout for 10% off your 1-year subscription. As the NFL draft happens here very shortly now, you can get all 3 versions of the RotoViz Rookie Guide for $20, including the 3rd, which comes out right after the draft. We appreciate you guys listening to the various shows. That helps us. We appreciate all the ratings and reviews as well. Those things help us a ton with the algorithm. If you want to help us, just leave a little note there, update your previous one, anything like that. Does juice it a little bit. We love you guys. We'll see you soon.